Imhotep, god of medicine, prince of peace, and the first Christ, from 2980 BC. No individual of the ancient world has left a deeper impression on history than Imhotep. He was the real father of medicine. He is, says Sir William Osier, the first figure of a physician to stand out clearly from the mists of antiquity. Of the details of his life, very little has survived, though numerous statues and statuettes of him have been found. He lived at the court of King Zoser of the Third Dynasty, about 2980 BC, where he established such a reputation as a healer that he was worshipped as a god for the next 3,000 years, not only in Egypt but also in Greece and Rome. Even early Christianity worshipped him as the Prince of Peace. His father was an architect named Canofer. His mother was Creduonk, and his wife Ronfrenofert. Imhotep appears to have been versatile like Aristotle and Leonardo da Vinci. In addition to being the chief physician to the king, he was sage and scribe, chief lector-priest, architect, astronomer, and magician. At that time, magic and medicine were allied, as in native Africa and the East today. He was also a poet and a philosopher. He preached cheerfulness and urged contentment. His proverbs, embodying a philosophy of life, caught popular fancy and were handed down from generation to generation. One of his best-known sayings is, "Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we shall die." There is evidence that the Egyptians, and perhaps Imhotep also, diagnosed and treated more than 200 diseases, among them 15 diseases of the abdomen and of the bladder, 10 of the rectum, 29 of the eyes, and 18 of the skin. They knew how to detect disease by the shape, color, or condition of the visible parts of the body, as the skin, hair, nails, tongue. They treated spinal tuberculosis, gallstones, appendicitis, gout, rheumatoid arthritis, mastoid diseases, and dental caries. They practiced surgery, knew of auscultation, and extracted medicine from plants. They were also familiar with the position and functions of the stomach, the lungs, and other vital organs. Imhotep, it is said, knew of the circulation of the blood, which is 4,000 years before it was known in Europe. This could be true because Egyptian civilization lasted for 6,000 years, which was sufficiently long for its thinkers and scientists to have carried research along most lines to a high degree. That Egypt, later he was jointly worshipped with the great conqueror Amenhotep III, and still later as the son of Ptah, father of the gods. Turn thy face towards me, my lord Imhotep, son of Ptah. It is thou who dost work miracles, and who are beneficent in all thy deeds, were the words of supplication addressed to him. The great temple of Amen, Karnak, contains 2 bas-reliefs of him. On the island of Philae there is a temple in his honor. The inscription to him there reads, Chancellor of the King of Lower Egypt, Chief under the King of Upper Egypt, Administrator of the Great Mansion, Hereditary Noble, Heliopolitan High Priest, Imhotep. When Egyptian civilization crossed the Mediterranean to become the foundation of Greek culture, the teachings of Imhotep were also absorbed there. But as the Greeks were wont to assert that they were the originators of everything, Imhotep was forgotten for thousands of years, and Hippocrates, a legendary figure who lived 2,000 years after him, became known as the father of medicine. The Encyclopedia Britannica says, the evidence afforded by Egyptian and Greek texts support the view that Imhotep's reputation was respected in very early times. His prestige increased with the lapse of centuries, and his temples in Greek times were the centers of medical teaching. Breasted says of Imhotep, in priestly wisdom, in magic, in the formulation of wise proverbs, in medicine and architecture, this remarkable figure of Zoser's reign left so notable a reputation that his name was never forgotten. He was the patron spirit of the later scribes, to whom they regularly poured out a libation from the water jug of their writing outfit before beginning their work. The people sang of his proverbs centuries later, and 12,500 years after his death, he had become a god of medicine, in whom the Greeks, who call him Imhotep, recognized their own Asclepios. A temple was erected to him near the Serapeum at Memphis, and at the present day every museum possesses a bronze statue or two of the apotheosized wise man, the proverb maker, physician and architect of Zoser. As regards Imhotep's influence in Rome, Gerald Massey, noted poet, archaeologist, and philologist, says that the early Christians worshipped him as one with Christ. The early Christians, it will be recalled, adapted to their use those pagan forms and personages whose influence through the ages had woven itself so powerfully into tradition that they could not omit them. Thus, says Massey, the child Christ remained a starrily bejeweled blackamoor as the typical healer in Rome. Jesus, the divine healer, does not retain the black complexion of Imhotep in the canonical Gospels, but he does in the Church of Rome when represented as a little black bambino. A jeweled image of the child Christ as a blackamoor is sacredly preserved at the headquarters of the Franciscan order, and true to its typical character as a symbolical likeness of Lusa, the healer. The little black figure is taken out in state with its regalia on to visit the sick and demonstrate the supposed healing power of this Egyptian Aesculapius. Thus Christianized, the Virgin Mother, who was also black, survived in Italy as in Egypt. At Oropa, near Beata, the Madonna and her child. Christ are not white, but black, as they so often were in Italy of old, and as the child is yet conditioned in the little black Jesus of the Eternal City. He adds, as regards the worship of Imhotep in Rome, surely the profoundest sigh of an ever-warring world went up to heaven in the cult of Imhotep, who is worshipped as the giver of rest, the Chemite Prince of Peace. Queen Hatshepsut, the ablest queen of far antiquity, from 1650 B.C. Hatshepsut of ancient Egypt was the greatest female ruler of all time, according to some Egyptologists. Among those whom she dominated was her brother, Thutmose III, the Napoleon of far antiquity. She is also said to have been the first woman in history to challenge the supremacy of the male, though arrayed against her were more than 3,000 years of masculine tradition. There was no word for queen or empress in the language of her day, but she fought her way to power and held the throne of the world's then leading empire for 33 years. Hatshepsut lived 150 years before Tutankhamun, or 3,500 years ago. Her father, Thutmose I, was the conqueror of the known world, and when he was stricken with paralysis, Hatshepsut became his chief aide. So efficient did she prove that Thutmose in time entrusted her with the management of the kingdom and made her co-ruler. When Thutmose called the nobles together, he said to them, "This daughter, Kumit Amen Hatshepsutu, the loving one, I put in my place. Henceforth she shall guide you. Listen to her words and submit unanimously to her commands. Whoever adores her, I will adore, but he who speaks evil against her majesty will die." Hatshepsut, together, father and daughter traveled over the empire, receiving homage, offering sacrifice in the temples, erecting monuments and buildings, improving industry and agriculture. But Hatshepsut had several rivals, principally the two sons of Thutmose, one of whom, later Thutmose II, was born of a wife not of royal birth, and was a minor. The other, later Thutmose III, was the son of a slave named Asnut. Thutmose III, hoping to oust Hatshepsut, staged a trick in the temple of Amun to demonstrate that it was he, not she, who was the elect of God. Whilst he was at prayer one day in a secluded part of the temple, he had a priestly procession which bore a glittering image of the supreme god, Amun-Ra, swerve suddenly into the main aisle, as if drawn by some unseen power, and come toward him, whereupon he fell prostrate to the ground, as if in a trance. It was then the priests declared that the god himself stepped out of his shrine, raised Thutmose to his feet, conducted him to the innermost altar where only the pharaoh could tread, and bade him rule over Egypt. This plot was extremely effective, and Hatshepsut was faced with the alternatives of war or compromise with Thutmose. She ended by marrying him. The two now put their father off the throne, but the old lion reasserted himself, drove them both out, and made Thutmose II, the real heir, ruler. The latter, however, was by all accounts a weakling, and died, it is believed, by assassination. At this period much of the record is lost, and there is a gap in the story of Hatshepsut. When we next hear of her, she is again on the throne with Thutmose III, who is now so strong that he is able to restrict her to the position of chief royal wife. However, by skillful intrigues, she not only restores herself as co-ruler, but finally thrusts him into the background as a mere husband, who is inferior to her prime minister, Nahusi, which name in Egyptian means full-blooded Negro. Hatshepsut had yet another handicap besides that of sex, namely ancestry. On her father's side, she was not of pure Theban stock, though her mother was. Her enemies, the priests of Amen, now seized on this taint in her lineage and plotted to dethrone her. To offset this, she began to publicize herself in the most sensational manner of that time, by the building of temples, pyramids, and obelisks, the size and grandeur of which were regarded by the popular mind as a gauge of the ruler's power. Accordingly, Hatshepsut decided to build a temple the like of which the world had never seen, and sent for her chief architect, Senmut, who to all appearances was a full-blooded Negro. Together they chose a site which was not only appropriate, but strategic. This was on an elevation 3 miles away from the stronghold of her opponents, the temple of Amen-Ra. From this site her temple looked down on theirs. Under Senmut's genius, Hatshepsut's temple developed into what is still one of the world's most remarkable specimens of architecture. It had a frontage of 800 feet, and was for the most part hollowed out of the great cliff that overlooked it. Double and triple rows of columns lined the entrance, and the approach was marked by innumerable statues, wonderful terraces, and paradisical gardens. Colorful inscriptions decorated the interior, which abounded in architectural novelties. Not content with this, Hatshepsut decided to canny her triumph into the very camp of her detractors. She ordered to be made 2 obelisks, taller than any others in Egypt. Each was hewn from mighty blocks of rose granite, and when completed took 2 great rafts, each manned by 900 men, to transport down the Nile. Hatshepsut intended these as a gift to the temple of Amen-Ra, but very astutely she had ordered them made so tall that they were higher than the temple, whose ruins, now known as Karnak, reveal it to be one of the most colossal structures made by man. Accordingly, to make the obelisks fit, the roof of the temple was opened, and from this Hatshepsut's obelisks reared their heads as chimneys over a roof. But that was not all. To make the obelisks still more conspicuous, she had their tops encased in electrum, a metal costlier than gold. Electrum was a composition of silver and gold. Silver being rarer than gold in ancient Egypt, it was more precious. In the bright sunlight of that rainless land, the obelisks shone like glittering peaks. Their brilliancy, in the queen's own words, lit up the 2 lands of Egypt. Whenever a resident of Thebes or a visitor looked out on the city, the most dazzling sight he saw was no longer the temple of Amen-Ra, but her obelisks. When the people entered the temple, they read on them this engraving: O ye people, who shall see my monument in the ages to come, beware of saying, I know not why this was made, and a mountain fashioned entirely from gold. These 2 obelisks my majesty hath wrought that my name may abide, enduring in this temple forever and ever. The queen's popularity increased, and she became firmly established. Great prosperity came to the land, and gold was so plentiful it was no longer weighed, but was measured in bushel baskets. She wrote in her own praise, It came to pass that her majesty was increased above all things, was beautiful to look at above all things. Her voice was that of a god, her frame was that of a god, her spirit was like a god. It came to pass that she was a beautiful maiden. But in spite of all this, she was still a woman with masculine prejudice against her. To overcome it, she boldly announced that she was really a man. Whether Egypt was startled we do not know, but this step crushed all further opposition. She donned male garb, changed her name from Hatshepsut to Hatshepsut, its male equivalent, and announced that she was of virgin birth. Her father, she declared, was not Thutmose I, but the great god Amun himself. The latter had appeared to her mother in a flood of light and perfume. The whole 7-story in its most intimate bedroom details was painted on the walls of her temple and may still be seen. The child shown as being born of this union is a boy. Thereafter, her sculptured portraits showed her with a man's chest and beard. She also took the title King of the North and South, Kam-Mara, the Horus of Gold, Bestower of Years, Conqueror of all lands, Vivifier of hearts, Chief Spouse of Amun, the Mighty One. But the feminine in her cropped up when she wrote of herself, His Majesty herself put with her own hands oil of Ani on all her limbs. Her fragrance was like a divine breath. Her scent reached as far as the land of Punt. Her skin is that of pure gold. It shines like the stars in the hall of festival in view of the whole land. She has no equal among the gods who were before, since the world was. She is living Ra, eternally. He hath selected her for protecting Egypt, for rousing bravery among men. I rule over this land like the son of Isis. I am mighty like the son of Nu. I shall be forever like the stars which changeth not. Hatshepsut sent expeditions to distant lands, one of which, to Punt, merits special attention. Punt was the traditional home of the earliest Egyptians and was located somewhere in East Africa. The mission was entrusted to her 3 favorites. Nahusi, the unmixed Negro, who is spoken of in her inscriptions as Prince Chancellor, First Friend, wearing the collar. Seniot, the architect, who is depicted as holding the queen's infant daughter, Neferwara, on his knees, and Thuti, her treasurer. They left with 5 vessels of about 300 tons each, and returned with gold, myrrh, incense, incense-bearing trees, strange animals, and other products of that region. The full story of this expedition may be read on the walls of her temple at Deir el-Bahari. In the 15th year of her reign and the 30th of her rule, she held a jubilee. Her husband, Thutmose III, was permitted to burn a little incense to Amun-Ra as he joined the procession. She wrote triumphantly, I have no enemy in all the land. All countries are my subjects. He, Amun-Ra, hath made my boundaries to the extremities of heaven. The circuit of the sun hath labored for me. At last she died, her end hastened, perhaps, by Thutmose III. Succeeding to the throne, he killed off her friends, defaced her inscriptions, chipped her features from her portraits, and walled in her obelisks, doing all with such thoroughness that she was forgotten for 300 years. In 1906, however, an American excavator, Theodore Davis, discovered her tomb and amazed the world with the story of this remarkable woman, a worthy predecessor of Elizabeth, Joan of Arc, and Catherine the Great. Hatshepsut's grandmother, Nefertari Ames, was Ethiopian, and is shown in her portraits as being very black. In addition, Hatshepsut was of southern Egyptian ancestry, which was and still is very much mixed with the pure Negroes of the Sudan, whose territory adjoined Egypt. Of Hatshepsut and her temple, Robert Hickens says, To me most feminine she seemed when I saw her temple at Deir el-Bahari with its brightness and its suavity, pretty shallowness and sunshine, its white and blue and yellow, and red and green and orange, all very trim and fanciful, all very smart and delicate. Full of finesse and laughter breathing out to me of the 20th century, the coquetry of a woman in 1500 B.C. After the terrific masculinity of Medinet Abu, after the great freedom of the Ramesseum and the grandeur of its Colossus, the manhood of the ages concentrated in granite, the temple of Deir el-Bahari came upon me like a delicate woman, perfumed and arranged. clothed in a creation of white and blue and orange, standing ever so knowingly against a background of orange and pink, of red and brown, a smiling coquette of the mountains, a gay and sweet enchantress who knew her pretty powers and meant to exercise them. A radiant queen reigns here, a queen of fantasy and splendor and of that divine shallowness, refined frivolity, literally cut into a mountain. Instead of being uplifted or overawed by form, we are rejoiced by color, by the high vivacity of arrested movement, by the story that color and movement tell, and over all there is a bright blue-painted sky, studded, almost distractedly studded, with a plethora of the yellow stars of the Egyptians made like starfish. Through this most characteristic temple one roves in a gaily attentive mood, feeling all the time Hatshepsut's fascination. One thing seems certain: Hatshepsut held her own until the last. Her tomb was discovered in the Valley of the Kings, where only the lordly males were buried. The queens had a burial place of their own. Hatshepsut's dearest wish was to live in the memory of mankind. To the Egyptian, that was true immortality. And she has achieved this, for graven in imperishable granite, her story is as fresh and fascinating now as when it was written 35 centuries ago. Thutmose III, the Napoleon of far antiquity from 1500 BC. Thutmose III, or Thutmose, mightiest conqueror and administrator of far antiquity, was the son of Thutmose I and a slave woman named Isis, or Osnut. In spite of this handicap of birth, he forged ahead of those nobler born and won supreme power not only in Egypt, but in the then-known world. Thutmose began his career as an ordinary priest in the temple of Amun at Thebes. His early bid for power failed in the long contest for the throne with Hatshepsut, his sister, for whom he proved no match. But upon her death, he emerged from the background to inaugurate a reign even more dazzling than hers. On ascending the throne, he continued the conquests begun by his mighty ancestor, Ahmes, who had ousted the Hyksos, or shepherd kings. Leading the way at the head of his army, mighty like a flame of fire, Thutmose III brought back to Egypt the kings of other nations to grace his triumphs, and such wealth of golden thrones, royal chariots, gold, jewels, gold and silver vessels, and cattle as had never fallen to Egypt before. It is on record that in his 70th year, the envoys from Nubia of the Negroes brought him a tribute of 1,570 pounds of gold from Waiwat alone. Utterly fearless, he once attacked an elephant in battle single-handed. The beast was about to seize him when his general, Amenemhab, struck off its trunk with a blow of his sword and saved his life. Unlike most conquerors of antiquity, Thutmose, it seems, was merciful and spared the conquered instead of putting the old and the decrepit to the sword. Says Breasted, his character stands forth with more color and individuality than that of any other king of early Egypt, save Akhenaten. We see the man of tireless energy unknown in any pharaoh before or since, the man of versatility designing exquisite vases in a moment of leisure, the lynx-eyed administrator who launched his armies upon Asia with one hand and with the other crushed the extortionate tax-gatherer. While he was proud to leave a record of his unparalleled achievements, Thutmose protests more than once his deep respect for the truth in so doing. His reign marks an epoch not only in Egypt, but in the whole East as we know it in his age. Never before in history had a single brain wielded the resources of so great a nation and wrought them into such centralized permanence and at the same time mobile efficiency, that for years they could be brought to bear with incessant impact as a skilled artisan manipulates a Rutan forge hammer. Although the figure is inadequate unless we remember that Thutmose forged his own hammer. The genius which rose from an obscure priestly office to accomplish this for the first time in history reminds us of an Alexander or a Napoleon. He built the first real empire, and is thus the first character possessed of universal aspects, the first world hero. From the fastnesses of Asia Minor, the marshes of the upper Euphrates, the islands of the sea, the swamps of Babylonia, the distant shores of Libya, the oases of the Sahara, the terraces of the Somali coast, and the upper cataracts of the Nile, the princes of his time rendered tribute to his greatness. He thus made not only a worldwide impression upon his age, but an impression of a new order. His commanding figure, towering like an embodiment of righteous penalty among the trivial plots of the petty Syrian dynasts, must have clarified the atmosphere of Oriental politics as a strong wind drives away miasmic vapors. The inevitable chastisement of his strong arm was held in awed remembrance by the men of Naharan for 3 generations. His name was one to conjure with for centuries after his empire had crumbled to pieces. It was placed on amulets as a word of power. Thutmose died at the age of 82. He built many temples. One of his obelisks was taken to Central Park, New York City. Another was set up on the Thames Embankment in London. Piankhy, king of Ethiopia and conqueror of Egypt, from 720 B.C. King Piankhy of Nubia watched his tribute of gold, cattle, slaves, and fighting men floating down the Nile to his overlord Osorkon III, king of Egypt. For more than 1,800 years his country had been dominated by Egypt, which drew from it much of her gold and most of her fighting men. Now he decided that when tribute was next due, he was going to be the receiver, not the giver. During his 25 years on the throne, he had been strengthening his power. With his renowned warriors who had won most of Egypt's battles for her, he was going to march until he reached the mouth of the Nile. King Osorkon and his viceroy, the high priest of Thebes, would both lick the dust from his feet, and he would return to his capital, Napata, loaded with wealth as no Nubian ruler had ever possessed before. This was in the 8th century B.C. His plans ready, King Piankhy started out on the conquest of the world's then mightiest power. His fleet and transports were so numerous that they stretched for miles down the river. As he advanced, he captured all the small towns, sacrificing to the gods of Nubia on their altars, until at last he arrived at the first fortress, Hermopolis. This he besieged and pressed so vigorously that the city was soon at his mercy. The ruler, Namlot, offered to surrender and sent many gifts, including even his crown, to win Piankhy's favor. But nothing availed until Namlot sent his queen to plead with Piankhy's women. Piankhy then consented to listen. Throwing himself prostrate at the conqueror's feet, Namlot cried, "Be appeased, Horus, lord of the palace. It is thy might which has done it. I am one of the king's slaves, paying impost into the treasury." To Piankhy he presented silver, gold, lapis lazuli, malachite, bronze, and costly stones. He filled Piankhy's treasury with the tribute and gave him a magnificent horse and a sistrum of gold and lapis lazuli. Namlot's example was followed by his people. Piankhy's inscription says, "Hermopolis threw herself upon her belly and pleaded before the king. Messengers came forth and descended, bearing everything beautiful to behold: gold, every splendid costly stone, clothing in a chest, and the diadem which was upon his head, the uraeus, which inspireth fear of him without ceasing during many days." Piankhy spared their lives. Later, when he visited the stables of Namlot and saw that the horses were famished, he expressed his pity. With his mighty fleet, Piankhy captured every city until he came to Memphis, which was strongly fortified with high walls, a large garrison, and an abundance of food and supplies. Landing on the north side of the city, Piankhy, though surprised at the strength of the place, devised a clever plan of assault. Seeing that the high walls on the west of the city had been recently raised still higher, he reasoned that the east side, naturally protected by waters, was probably being neglected. In the harbor, ships floated so high that their bow ropes were fastened to the houses of the city. Piankhy, therefore, sent his fleet against the harbor and speedily captured all shipping. Then, taking command in person, he rapidly ranged the captured craft together with his own fleet along the eastern walls. This furnished a footing for his assaulting lines, which he immediately sent over the ramparts, capturing the city before the western defenses could get into action. Tefnachte, the commander, surrendered humbly. Thus, Piankhy won mastery of all the region around Memphis and continued his triumphant march toward Heliopolis, toward the temple of the great god Amun-Ra, toward the palace of Osorkon. Piankhy. When he reached Heliopolis, King Osorkon and all the lords of the Delta, 15 in number, surrendered without resistance. An inscription reads, "He came into the house of Ra and entered into the temple with great praise." The chief ritual prayed to the god that the rebels might be repelled from the king. The Dewat chamber was visited that the Sadat garment might be fastened on. He was purified with incense and libations. Garlands from the Pyramidon house were presented to him, and flowers were brought to him. He ascended the steps of the front window to behold Ra in the Pyramidon house. The king himself stood alone. He broke through the bolts, opened the double doors, applied the clay, and sealed them with the king's own seal. He charged the priests, "I have proved the seal. No other shall enter therein of all the kings who shall arise." They threw themselves upon their bellies before his majesty, saying, "To abide, to endure without perishing, O Horus, beloved of Heliopolis." By thus entering the Holy of Holies of the sun god, Piankhy symbolized his mastery of Egypt. Ethiopia had become mistress of the then-known world. This done, Piankhy sailed for his home in the south, his ships laden with silver, gold, copper, clothing, and everything of the Northland, every product of Syria and all the sweet woods of God's land. His Majesty sailed upstream with glad heart. The shores on either side were jubilating. West and east, singing, "O mighty ruler Piankhy, thou comest having gained the dominion of the north. Thou art unto eternity, thy might endureth, O ruler, beloved of Egypt." And references tell us that what is known of Piankhy comes chiefly from a magnificent granite stele which he caused to be erected in the temple of Amun, and which bears on its four sides the story of the expedition in detail. This is said to be the clearest and most rational account of a military expedition which has survived from ancient Egypt. The ruins of the mighty temples built by the Black Monarch can be seen at Napata. He was succeeded by his brother, Sabikon, who pushed Ethiopian dominion as far north as Assyria and Palestine. Sabikon, or Shabaka, was the founder of the Exkveth dynasty, and according to Manetho, it was he who burned Bochoris alive. One of his most noted generals was Taharka, a son of Piankhy, who later succeeded to the throne. It was one of the successors of Taharka, King Nastasen, who defeated the great Persian conqueror Cambyses in 525 B.C. But as time went on, Ethiopia receded in importance in world history, to emerge after 1,000 years as a Christian kingdom in the 4th century.
Shaka, or Shaka Zulu, one of Shaka's most talked-about exploits at this time, was a combat with a huge madman who was terrorizing the district. He had robbed and killed a number of people, and when several soldiers were sent to take him in custody, he beat them off. Shaka attacked him single-handed, and in a terrific fight killed him. Even his father, who had once cast him off, became one of his greatest admirers. The latter, on a visit to Cetshwayo, was honored by a tribal dance, and seeing one of the warriors whose fire and grace excelled all the others, asked who he was. When told that it was his own son, he was so delighted that he called him over and named him his heir, despite the fact that he was not born of a union with one of his own wives. Shaka was 26 when his father died. Another son, Sihwana, took his father's place, but Shaka ambushed and killed him while he was bathing. When another half-brother, Dingaan, came by, Shaka merely laughed at him and told him to go on his way. Later, Dingaan was to become a powerful chief, and Shaka was to regret that he had only laughed. But now that he was chief, he felt secure. When Shaka took over that chieftainship, the Zulus were an insignificant tribe owning less than 100 square miles of land. His secret ambition was to make himself ruler of all blacks. He started out with the material at hand. His first step was to segregate all married men between the ages of 30 and 40. He built a separate kraal for them, which he called Belebele, meaning everlasting plague. Shaka hated married men. Next, he segregated the youths between 17 and 20, informing them that they were to remain bachelors. He subjected them to Spartan discipline. To inspire them with an example of bravery, he once sat down on a hornet's nest, scooped out the angry insects, and beat them off without rising. He wanted strong men only. N. Isaacs, an English traveler who knew Shaka well, said of these youths, "Their figures are the noblest that my eye has ever gazed upon, their movements the most graceful, and their attitude the proudest, standing like forms of monumental bronze." Hailing their chief with a kind of fascist salute, they would say, "You mountain, you lion, you elephant, you that are black." Shaka next revolutionized military tactics. It is claimed that he took his ideas from the whites. This may be true, but it seems more likely that they were the product of his own resourceful courage. At that time, it was the custom for an African warrior in battle to throw his spear and immediately advance or retreat according to the action of the enemy. Shaka considered this ineffective, if not cowardly. He ordered the spears that had hitherto been used to be scrapped and had his blacksmiths forge long swords with short hafts. This type of weapon could not be thrown. It could be used only at close quarters. For protection, he equipped each soldier with a shield of toughened cowhide his own height. He also changed the attack formation, modeling it after the shape of a bull's horns. In the center were the main body and the reinforcements, while two forward flanks curved out to enclose the enemy. Shaka was not ready for action, but before he commenced, he took several precautions. Certain that some of his relatives would try to usurp his place while he was gone, he caught as many of his half-brothers, uncles, aunts, and other relatives as he could lay hands on and killed them. Then he set out to settle old scores with the Langani, who had been cruel to him when he was a boy. Invading their lands, he called the whole tribe together, and picking out those against whom he bore a grudge, had them all impaled on sharp stakes, set the stakes on fire, and left them to die in slow agony. His next objective was Piankhy, chief of the Buthelezi. When the two forces met, the Buthelezi, confident in their old way of victory, threw their spears. But to their amazement, Shaka's warriors caught the weapons on their shields, flung the same back, and charged down on them with blood-curdling yells. Soon, the Buthelezi were in headlong flight. Shaka took all their cattle and gave the young captive warriors the option of joining his army or death. His men then slaughtered the rest, except the young wives and virgins. As to Piankhy, he left him to die a slow death sitting upright on a sharp stake. After wiping out several other smaller tribes, Shaka set out against Matwane, chief of the Ngwanami, who was held to be invincible. To stimulate his courage, this ferocious chief had the habit of drinking the gall from the livers of the chiefs he had slain. When Matwane learned of Shaka's plans, he marched off to ally himself with Zwide, king of the Ndwandwe, whose territory lay beyond the Drakensberg Mountains. After Cetshwayo, Zwide was the most powerful king in South Africa, and he, too, thirsted for supreme power. He welcomed Matwane, and the two hatched a plan to eliminate Cetshwayo. Instead of attacking him openly, they enticed him into a hut and chopped off his head. Taking out his heart, liver, and other vital organs, Zwide boiled them and drained off the fat for a charm. Shaka was beside himself over the death of his old master, and to make sure of its support, he annexed the whole tribe after killing the chief who had succeeded Cetshwayo. Zwide, now ready, marched to meet Shaka. Fearing that the powerful Ngwanas might join Zwide's forces, Shaka attacked them, massacring some 30,000 of them. While in the vicinity, he annihilated the Tembas for good measure. Zwide, on the march, induced many other chiefs to join him, but this did not help. The two finally met on the banks of the Motletus River, and a battle fought until the river ran red with blood and corpses were piled deep. It was Zwide who withdrew. In the course of these campaigns, Shaka had not neglected the organization of his army and kingdom. On the theory that the standard of physical fitness he desired could be attained only by curbing promiscuity between the sexes, he placed all the young unmarried girls in enclosures 10 feet high, where they were reared under the strictest supervision. Any male caught within the stockades was killed. Boys were drafted into the army at the age of 13. At 17, after rigorous disciplining and training, they were assigned to a regiment. None of these youths was allowed to speak to a girl. Their business, Shaka told them, was war, not love. Men of a given class or age were compelled to many mates picked out for them. Only warriors of extraordinary distinction were permitted to select their wives. Divorces were forbidden. Adulterers were thrown headlong from a cliff into the Umvelosi River to be devoured by crocodiles. Circumcision was forbidden. The interests of the nation came first, Shaka preached. Shaka's reforms even affected cooking. He saw to it that his warriors were fed only the best, and the quality of the beer was ordered improved. He imposed hard rules upon himself and lived up to them. He was practically abstinent sexually and never took a wife. He wanted no children, and once, when one of his few concubines presented a son to him saying that it was his, he killed the child with one blow of his fist and sent the mother to her death. When his white friend Isaacs told him of George III's advanced age and that the English king had but one wife, Shaka said to his people, "You see, King George is like me. He does not indulge in promiscuous intercourse with women. That accounts for his long life." Shaka's whole being was concentrated on supremacy. Iron himself, he imposed his hardness on others. The warrior who showed the slightest fear was as good as dead. After each battle, Shaka held a review, and as the warriors marched by, he called out those of whom he had not had a good report. These were stabbed to death on the spot. It was certain death for a beaten regiment to return. Shaka's motto was literally death or victory. There was but one way for a Zulu soldier to march, he told his men, and that was forward. The families of disgraced soldiers were put to death with them. On occasion, he would let a lion loose and expect his soldiers to kill him with their bare hands. He would have been an ideal god of war for the Greeks. In the course of his conquests, he defeated Cetshwayo, a chief who had called him a silly jackass in earlier days. Storming the mountain fortress of King Mashida of Pepeda-land, he tossed the king and his men to death on the crags below. Zwaide, with a strengthened army, headed once again for Zululand. On the march to meet him, Shaka laid waste all the land over which Zwaide would pass, and then withdrew. Zwaide, who had left his base with only a day's rations in the expectation that he could forage cattle and food on the way, found himself without food. After 4 days, when Zwaide's men were worn out from hunger, Shaka sent out his young bloods to attack them, and there was great slaughter and another victory. The last obstacle in the way of his goal of achieving supremacy in South Africa was the still unsubjected territory of Zwaide's people, the Ndwandwe. With an army of 30,000, he set out for Ndwandaland. As he approached, Zwaide's people, some 40,000 men, women, and children, sought refuge in the mountains. With Shaka in hot pursuit, they made a stand on the plateau of a snow-covered mountain. The Zulus, coming to within a few feet of the Ndwandwes, halted. A dramatic silence ensued, while each warrior steeled himself for the coming conflict. Then Shaka gave the signal, and the carnage commenced. When it was over, every single Ndwandwe had been tossed from the cliffs. Shaka's nearest enemy was at least 600 miles distant now. Some tribes, fearing him, had fled further yet, thus coming into conflict with others. Hunger and cannibalism stalked in his wake. Some historians say that, directly and indirectly, he caused the death of over 2,000 persons. In 1820, 4 years after he started out on his first campaign, and at the age of 34, he had conquered a territory larger than France. A ring of desert land and devastated area protected it from invasion. His people had become immensely wealthy. The young men, the wives, the lands, the cattle of their victims were theirs. As for the handful of whites in South Africa at that time, they thought it best to be on friendly terms with Shaka. "King George and I," Shaka would say to his white visitors, "are brothers. I have conquered all the blacks, and he has conquered all the whites." When he strode onto the parade field, a Herculean figure, his warriors would salute him, "Bayets," the equivalent of "Hail Caesar." Then to the clashing of swords they would chant, "Thou hast scattered all the nations. What remains now for thy forces to fight? Oh, what remains now for thy forces to fight?" Indeed, this was Shaka's most troublesome problem. He had a magnificent army of 100,000 strong, restless for battle, but no one to fight. To get rid of the surplus, he would incite one regiment to attack another. With no outside enemies on which to fix their hate, His people began fighting among themselves. Foes among his own people sprang up like mushrooms. To preserve order, he kept executioners by his side and had people impaled or their hands chopped off for no reason but to create fear. Defiance increased, however. His enemies grew bolder. Once while he was dancing, someone struck at his heart with a dagger but succeeded only in wounding his arm. Thousands were put to death in retaliation. Even his pet monkey filled people with dread. Ngomane, his old friend and counselor, and his mother sought in vain to stem the slaughter. When his mother died, some 7,000 persons were put to death. Shaka wept, and all whose eyes were dry, or who did not come to the royal city to mourn, were executed. 9 years of this unbridled tyranny filled the people with desperation, and they longed for his death. Dingaan, his half-brother, resolved to kill him at all costs. Plotting together with one of Shaka's domestics named Satam, Dingaan and his brother Mahlangana crept into Shaka's hut and stabbed him as he sat before the fire. They plunged the dagger into him again and again. Before he died, Shaka said, "What have I done to you, O children of my father?" Shaka's body was flung into a corn pit where it was left to the vultures. James Stewart, Assistant Secretary of Native African Affairs in South Africa, said of Shaka, "In his own unenviable career of unbridled ferocity, celerity, and cunning, he stands alone and unrivaled. Whilst among barbarians in strategy, tactics, and executive capacity, he is again probably without a peer. He, in short, seems to have turned a page, albeit a dark one, that no mortal, white, yellow, brown, or black, has ever before managed quite to turn. In that sense, he is, I should say, at the head of all other despots. He shows what an able man in power can accomplish, once his passions and ambitions have free play and opportunity serves. So long as the soldier and the conqueror are worshipped, Shaka deserves a certain kind of recognition. Monster that he was, he did some good for his people. By organizing them, he made it much more difficult for white men to seize their lands. His legacy of physical training gave the Zulu the finest physique in the world. Years later, when the English wanted to conquer the Zulus, they demanded that Zulu youths be permitted to marry. Shaka had but one fear, that of old age. When he learned that in the land of the white man there was a muti for turning gray hair black, he wanted it, regardless of cost. Shaka was the destructive force of an earthquake or a hurricane imprisoned in the soul of one man. Before such a spectacle, one can but stand in awe and horror. Cetshwayo, Zulu king who defeated a British army and killed the Prince Napoleon, 1884. Cetshwayo, king of the Zulus, was the hero of the greatest little war that England ever had. Armed only with spears and knives, his men inflicted on the British the most crushing defeat that England experienced at the hands of any portion of a dark race in modern times. His victory at Isandlwana was marked by one of the most terrifying slaughters in the annals of warfare. In one skirmish, he defeated and killed Prince Napoleon, heir to the French throne. It took England over $100,000 and her ablest general to cope with this African, so-called Negro king. Cetshwayo had an amazing people as his subjects. Of all peoples, they possessed and still possess the finest and most perfect physiques. A white American woman visiting Zululand while out walking met a Zulu. So great was the physical force he radiated that when he passed, she said she felt as if she had been overthrown by a wave of power. Once a missionary, in trying to frighten Cetshwayo into accepting Christianity, told him of hellfire. "Hellfire!" Cetshwayo laughed scornfully. "Do you frighten me with hellfire? My soldiers would put it out. See?" He pointed to a grass fire which was burning over a considerable tract of land, and calling to the officer commanding a regiment, he ordered, "Before you look at me again, eat up that fire." In an instant, thousands, shouting their war cry, bounded toward the fire, leaping into it barefooted, and the fire was soon eaten up without regard to those who were maimed and permanently injured. A warrior's outfit consisted of a shield of dried hide, 2 or 3 spears, and a short blade for stabbing. As to clothing, he wore only a loincloth. Discipline was most rigid. There was only one penalty for disobedience or neglect of duty: death. A warrior knew he must conquer or die, for certain death awaited a beaten army. He who ran or showed a trace of fear in battle was instantly cut down by the man behind him. According to Colonel Brown, who saw service against the Zulus, a Zulu warrior could march 30 miles a day, and if need be, 50, and give battle at the end of the day. The Bible and Greek mythology tell of giants whose tread shook the earth. When Cetshwayo's army of 35,000 marched, the earth literally trembled. Not since the days of ancient Sparta had the world seen a body of fighting men comparable in physique. And Cetshwayo needed this army to protect his kingdom, the kingdom he had inherited from his granduncle, Shaka, himself a great conqueror and the founder of the Zulu nation. The Boers, or Dutch settlers, were treacherously encroaching on his territory. Years before, to escape British persecution further south, they had migrated into his land and had been welcomed by his uncle Dingaan. Later, they became so grasping that Dingaan was incited to massacre them. British colonial politics did not view Cetshwayo and his soldiers with a friendly eye. But as British policy was always to divide and conquer, he was allowed to keep his army. It could be used to frighten their rivals, the Boers. Besides, the British thought they could easily handle Cetshwayo. They felt sure that when the time came, all that would be necessary would be to march into his territory with a few field pieces and machine guns, press a button or two, and presto, his army would disappear. But they took care to see that shotguns were kept out of his reach. In time, the Boers surrendered their republic, leaving the British a free hand in South Africa, except for Cetshwayo, whose presence now took on a different aspect. From being a tool of British foreign policy, he was now a menace. The Boers, now British subjects, must be protected. Cetshwayo must go. Having no love for the British, but deciding to use them against Cetshwayo, the Boers laid claim to a part of Cetshwayo's territory and began to settle on it. Cetshwayo drove them away. The British, called in as arbiters, decided in favor of Cetshwayo, but seized the opportunity to scold him about affairs in his own kingdom. For instance, he had banished the missionaries because they had been plotting against him and meddling in his national affairs. One of them had written a letter to the governor of Cape Colony, declaring that only the utter destruction of the Zulus can secure peace in South Africa. The British also made several demands, among them that Zulu warriors be permitted to many, that Cetshwayo permit a British resident, a sort of official spy, to live in his capital, and to crown all, that he disband his army. Cetshwayo was astounded at this ultimatum. It was as if a judge, after deciding in favor of the plaintiff, had proceeded to lecture him on his personal affairs that had not come before the court. Miss Sarah Frances Colenso, Cetshwayo's defender among the whites, said that he was treated as if he were a child instead of the head of a nation. There was but one alternative for Cetshwayo. Rising from his throne to his magnificent 6'4" of brawn, he flung his defiance at the white envoys. "Go back and tell the white men this, and let them hear it well. Myself and every one of my men will die first. I give you until sunset to get out of my territory." Early in January 1879, the British, 12,000 strong, under Lord Chelmsford, invaded Zululand at 3 different points. On the 22nd, one of these columns, composed of 1,000 whites and 2,000 blacks, under Colonel Durnfold, fell in with a Zulu army of 10,000. The Zulus, as was their custom, began by chanting their war song, a song without words. It was wonderfully impressive and stirring, as the waves of sound majestically rose and fell, then rose again, in a weird, mournful strain, yet warlike in the extreme. This ended, the order to march was given, and the long black line swept steadily and terribly forward to encircle the foe. In the front were the young warriors, behind them, the veterans. The British, entrenching themselves behind their wagons, opened fire with their artillery and machine guns. The Zulus, armed only with spears, came rushing on, shouting their battle cry, while the guns mowed them down in rows like wheat in the path of a reaper. But charging madly home to death or victory, the gallant black warriors pressed grimly on until they reached the barricade. Then, leaping over, they gave the enemy a taste of what fighting at close quarters and with equal weapons meant. Next morning, when Colonel Brown, one of the scouts, wandered on the scene, he beheld a sight such as few human beings have ever witnessed. A vast, silent field of dead. 6,500 warriors lay there. There were no wounded. The Zulus had killed the entire British force, all but 42, who escaped by swimming their horses down the stream. In their mad rush, says Brown, the Zulus had killed everything, even the horses, dogs, and mules. There were heaps and heaps of Zulu dead. Where the machine guns had mowed them down, they lay in heaps. In addition, the Zulus had captured 40,000 cartridges and the rifles of the British. Of the Zulus, 3,500 lay dead, not to mention the wounded, who had been carried off. A few days later, Cetshwayo again defeated the British at Rorke's Drift and laid siege to Cetshwayo. He followed it with another victory at Inhotep. At the news of this defeat, the whites in South Africa were in consternation. They saw themselves sharing the same awful fate. They cabled to England for aid, and the same week, 15,000 soldiers under Lord Wolseley, with the latest equipment, left for the Cape. Among the volunteers was the Prince Napoleon, son and heir of the recently deposed Napoleon III of France. In August 1879, the British, strongly reinforced again, invaded Zululand. With a force of 15,000, Lord Chelmsford met Cetshwayo and his 25,000 warriors at Ulundi. Strongly entrenched behind their ammunition carts and wagons, the British opened fire at a range of 1,000 yards. The Zulu heroes charged with their usual courage, but it was impossible for them, ill-armed as they were, to pass the belt of fire that protected their foes. Against the machines, valor and bravery counted for naught. A thrill of admiration passed through me, says Brown, when I thought of the splendid courage of the savages who could advance to the charge, suffering such awful punishment. Finally, Cetshwayo was forced to withdraw, leaving 5,000 of his men dead. A few days later, however, Cetshwayo caused another surprise. One of his detachments defeated and killed Prince Napoleon, causing great excitement in Europe and extinguishing the hopes of the Napoleonic party in France. Soon after this, Cetshwayo was captured and kept a prisoner for 3 years, during which time his country, missing his strong hand, fell into anarchy. Many kings arose, and the tribes were broken up. At last, even his enemies began to demand his return, and Cetshwayo was granted his wish to go to England to present his case to Queen Victoria. When he arrived in England, he was accorded a reception such as few monarchs have received. The Zulu War had been very unpopular with the people at home. They felt that Cetshwayo had only been protecting his land as any other patriot would have done. This opinion was strengthened when they found that Cetshwayo was not the man-eating savage his enemies had depicted him as, but a courteous, amiable, and smiling gentleman. Queen Victoria was so impressed with him that she personally promised to restore him to power. In the words of Thiel, a white South African, he was received and treated as if he had been a beneficent and civilized ruler who had merely done his duty to his people by heroically endeavoring to protect them against an invading army. Great crowds assembled to hear him wherever he went. Deputations from various societies waited on him. He was taken to see places of interest, far and near. In short, he was made the lion of the day, such as no white head of a third-rate state would have been. As a guest of the British government, he was provided with everything that could tend to his comfort, and he was fitted out with clothing in the greatest variety and of the most expensive kind. He appeared in London dressed as an English gentleman, and what is wonderful, really, he conducted himself as though he had been accustomed all his life to wear a silk hat and kid gloves. Great as is the power of imitation of the ordinary African, Cetshwayo certainly excelled all his countrymen in this wise. Presents of the most incongruous kinds were showered on him, such as gold lockets and cashmere shawls, 3 wagon loads in all. He would have been utterly spoiled if it had not been that his intense desire to return to Zululand overcame all other feelings and enabled him to keep his senses. When questioned by the Prime Minister about his defeat, Cetshwayo said, "Yes, we lost some very fine men, but what could all our courage do against you English? You stand still and only by turning around make the bodies of our warriors fly in pieces, legs here, arms there, heads, everything. Whew! What could we do against that?" Despite the Queen's promises, the home officials, on the demand of the South Africans, did little. Worse, when Cetshwayo returned to Zululand, he found that his kingdom had been split into 3 parts, only one of which was restored to him. Anxious to rebuild his nation, he made war on one of these chiefs, Usibepu, but the latter, aided by the whites, defeated him. On February 9, 1844, Cetshwayo died, presumably of heart trouble. Sir T. Shepstone, governor of Natal, one of his foes, speaks in the highest terms of his personal character and his indomitable courage. He was remarkably frank and straightforward, he says, with much force of character and a dignified manner. Ms. Colenso says, Cetshwayo's treatment reflected no credit on the name of England. One might add that the treatment of this fine and brave people and their continued exploitation in the mines of South Africa are a blot on white civilization. It was not until years after Cetshwayo's death that the home government was convinced that a grave injustice had been done to him.
Emperor Tewodros II, the man who rebuilt Ethiopia. From chaos. Before Ethiopia became the symbol of African independence, before Adwa shocked the world, before European colonizers feared Ethiopian resistance, there was one man who dragged Ethiopia out of collapse with sheer willpower. His name was Tewodros II, and without him, modern Ethiopia may never have existed. In the early 1800s, Ethiopia was broken apart in what historians call the era of princes, a period where warlords, regional kings, and rival nobles fought endlessly for power. The country was divided. Authority was weak. Foreign powers watched closely, waiting for the perfect moment to interfere. Then came a young warrior named Shaka Zulu. Born into hardship and instability, Shaka was not born as a powerful emperor. He fought his way upward through intelligence, military skill, and vision. He defeated rival princes one by one and eventually crowned himself Emperor Tewodros II in 1855. His dream was revolutionary. Not a weak Ethiopia divided by tribes and princes, but one strong, united Ethiopian nation. That idea alone changed history. Tewodros began building what many historians consider the foundations of modern Ethiopia: a centralized state, a national army, modern administration, diplomacy with foreign nations, road building and infrastructure, attempts at modern manufacturing and weapon production. He even invited European craftsmen and engineers into Ethiopia to modernize the country's military and technology. At a time when much of Africa was being colonized, Tewodros understood something early. If Ethiopia did not modernize, Europe would eventually try to destroy it. And he was right. After tensions with Britain escalated, the British Empire launched one of the largest military expeditions in African history against Ethiopia in 1868 under General Robert Napier. Thousands of British and Indian troops marched toward Emperor Tewodros' mountain fortress at Magdala with modern artillery and advanced weapons. But Tewodros refused humiliation. He knew capture would mean becoming a symbol of African defeat before Europe. So when the British finally breached Magdala, Tewodros chose death over surrender. Using a pistol gifted to him years earlier by Queen Victoria herself, he shot himself rather than be captured alive. That moment became legendary across Africa. Because Tewodros showed the world something rare during the Age of Empire, an African emperor who refused to kneel. Even the British reportedly respected his courage after death. But perhaps his greatest achievement was this: he ended the era of princes and reintroduced the idea of a united Ethiopia. Without Tewodros, there may have been no Johannes IV, no Menelik II, no Battle of Adwa, no Ethiopia capable of resisting European colonization. He died defeated militarily, but victorious historically, because modern Ethiopia began with him.